Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei from Beijing. We begin today's program with this year's G7 virtual summit. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, this year's G7 chairman, hopes to convene the first in-person group summit in nearly 2 years in June. He's using the virtual talks to be held very soon to urge the development of new vaccines in 100 days. Fighting the pandemic, rebuilding the global economy, and coping with climate change are all high on the agenda. U.S. President Joe Biden also makes his first presidential debut on the world stage since he took office in January. On Thursday, U.S. officials said the Biden administration will pledge a $4 billion contribution to COVAX, a global initiative led by the World Health Organization to ensure equitable access to vaccines. However, the timetable is not clear. After Trump's America First policy, Biden has sought to reverse the situation, projecting a message of re-engagement with the world and with global institutions. But how hard will it be for Biden to rebuild ties with his G7 allies? And what does the G7 still offer to the world now? For more on the G7 and what can be achieved and what are still the question marks, we are joined in Chapel Hill in North Carolina, Klaus Laris, the Distinguished Professor of History, International Affairs from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In Tokyo, Tako Yashikatsu, Adjunct Associate Professor from the Asia Global Institute at Hong Kong University. In Washington, D.C., Peter Kuznick, a professor of history from American University. Last but not least, in Shanghai, we will be joined later by Shending Li, professor at the Institute of International Studies from Fudan University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let me start by asking the three gentlemen coming from originally Germany, Japan, and the United States. How high shall we have our hope for this year's virtual summit of the G7. Mr. Kuznick, would you like to begin briefly?
Sure, I'd be happy to begin.
Thank you, sir.
It depends on what the goal is going to be. Clearly, Biden wants to show that the United States is engaged with the world again, and he wants to show that the United States is going to lead the world again. The question is the rest of the world looking for or willing to accept American leadership? What the positive that could come out of this is a strong commitment to dealing with the pandemic in a global way that is much more fair and inclusive. As UN Secretary General Guterres has said, the current situation is absolutely untenable.
Okay.
Where the should I continue?
Yes, maybe very briefly.
The G7 countries now have administered 75% of the doses worldwide. There are 130 countries that have administered no doses of the vaccine so far. So the first challenge to the G7 is to deal with the question of making this much more equitable globally. Then we've got other challenges as well.
Right. Let's start just by talking about the vaccines. Professor Laris, I know none of you is this epidemiologist, but rather we are focusing on the politics and also on the public policy of the vaccines. Professor Laris, 3 billion doses of vaccines have been acquired by Japan, Australia, the United States, the EU countries together with Canada. And yet, all they need to do, all the population of these countries, even having 2 doses per person, will still have 1.3 billion more left. Now, will the G7 virtual summit be able to contribute in real terms and in clear words what time and what doses to whom those could be available? Professor Laris.
Perhaps to some extent, but this is a family meeting of the Western democracies. They know each other very well. It's President Biden's first foray into international policy at a big meeting. So there will be a lot of goodwill towards him. And I think everyone is aware of the problem regarding the vaccine distribution to the world outside the Western world. And they will go and strengthen the COVAX initiative, which is meant to provide vaccines to the developing world. Biden has also promised $4 billion of American money to put into that initiative, $2 billion almost immediately. Whether that will be enough, we will have to see. President Macron's suggestion to dedicate 5% of the Western world's vaccines to the developing world, to countries or continents like Africa, that has been rejected by Biden, I believe for largely domestic reasons, because many American people would not be impressed if the United States gave vaccines to outside America rather than vaccinating its own people first. And there's a severe problem with obtaining vaccines within the United States. Many states, many cities have problems getting the vaccine for Americans. So for domestic reason, I think Biden has decided to give money rather than promising to give actual vaccines.
Right.
But once Americans have been vaccinated by June, I think we will see probably something different here.
Well, there are several things I probably need to clarify here. COVAX is not necessarily just a platform that will provide vaccines to developing countries. In fact, developed countries, after joining COVAX, could also purchase and have access to vaccines through COVAX. So that's one thing to clarify. Another thing to clarify, COVAX, despite of operating in full capacity, by the end of the years that it has claimed, only 20% of the world's population could be vaccinated. That's so far away from any herd immunity that needs to be achieved in any country. So we need to clarify this just to say COVAX is not a magic. And meanwhile, it's not just developing countries that are getting vaccines from the COVAX, but also developed economies as well. This is very clear. Certainly, it's not about the cash, because the vaccines are in short supply compared to the cash that could be offered in the world. It's the vaccine that really counts. Having said that, though, let me go to you, Mr. Yoshikatsu. My same question. Will the G7 countries be able to say clearly this time how much can they contribute in terms of vaccine to the rest of the world, which they have been hoarding over the year?
I think now the President Biden is coming up with, and now for G7, I think the most important thing is show our leadership, G7's leadership and unity. And because now, maybe over the last couple of years, G7's credibility or accountability are, very much doubted. And in this sense, at this moment, and Boris Johnson is going to host the real G7 conference in June. So before that, I think now we can meet up and we can show our leadership and unity and show our agenda. We need to aggressively respond to COVID-19 and vaccine in terms of vaccine distribution and how to coexist our the tackle to COVID-19 and the economic recovery. And in this agenda, the G7 as liberal democracies, we can demonstrate our leadership and unity to be responsible for this very important time. So this is the first agenda. And then what's going on? Let's see. And I do not think it's going to be very easy to provide the vaccine distribution or allocating the real resources to respond to the pandemic. So let's see what's going on.
Professor Shen, on the other hand, I do want you to join in as well. China, of course, is not part of the G7, but the world is watching the G7 very closely right now because it's the first time after U.S. President Biden comes into the White House. How much will G7 still relevant to the world? What do you think will be some of the barometers, the other parts of the world are looking at right now?
Well, G7 is not irrelevant at this time yet, But increasingly, as other international platforms like G20, United Nations, WHO, and APEC, etc., they would play their respective role. So it's important for G7 to partner with other countries and other regional and global platforms to work together, contributing the battering of the COVID-19 together. Not just G7 or China would give some 37 countries. We should shake hands and work together. G7 should welcome China, and China should also welcome G7 and individual members of G7, especially the US, to pay a good contribution. I have heard that France is willing to give 5% of what it is going to use. That 5% is measured by millions. But the entire developing country, in terms of the population, is measured by billions. Therefore, France's commitment, in my view, is far short of what the US will do and what the rest of the world would expect of France.
We earlier have already looking at some of the footages coming in. The G7 virtual summit has already begun as we go on with our discussion. So we have something going on here, gentlemen, that's very interesting, is whether the G7 nations and parties have been able to clarify what they really want to do individually. And at this critical time, at a time when probably they have to choose A or B or one or two, would they be able to come to consensus about the choices? That's an interesting question, isn't it? Mr. Yoshikatsu, your thoughts about that. Will G7 be able to choose together, come to consensus? After all, they've been apart for at least 4 years, if not more.
Yes, Tianwei, you just mentioned the U.S. re-engagement to multilateralism or global institution. And actually, this is a very important thing for G7 leaders at this moment, because over the last 4 years, actually, the G7 was quite, divided. So we couldn't have shared basic vision. So, for example, what is democracy? What is multilateralism? What is human rights? Actually, even among 7 countries, we couldn't have shared very well. So now, I think the most important thing is let's make sure what is the world, what we want to embrace, right? Multilateralism is very important, and regional integration is very important. Respect on United Nations or World Health Organization is quite important. So now, at this critical moment, the most important thing for us is make sure what is the most important thing. As a developed economy, we need to be responsible for the world peace and human beings, right? So this is the top priority at the moment, and now this is just the beginning.
But it's very interesting to talk about the principles, because the principles one would assume should have long been shared. If the principles are not even being shared, that would be very interesting, whether G7 still exists at all as an entity. Having said that, though, it is about how the principles will be translated into realities, isn't it? Professor Pusnik, we've seen the U.S. Withdraw from WHO, WTO, and of course the climate agreement. But now, with the Biden administration coming into power, it's coming back, but nobody knows what's going to happen in 4 years, probably even 2 years during the midterm election. So how do you see the U.S. will be able to testify to the allies that it will be back and will always be back? I think that's one interesting question.
We don't really know what's going to happen in 2 years or 4 years in the United States. The situation here is quite volatile right now. We just saw an insurrection a month ago at the Capitol. That was an attempted fascist coup in the United States. So things are very, very uncertain. But Biden at least is starting off in the right direction. I mean, today, the United States officially re-enters the Paris Climate Accords, which Biden announced his first day. He's rejoined the WHO. He renewed the New START treaty with Russia, very, very important. The reality is that the world confronts 2 or 3 existential crises right now that we've got to deal with as a global community, because it affects everybody. We've got the climate change, which is a serious threat. We've got the nuclear arms race. All 9 nuclear powers are modernizing their nuclear arsenals, making them more efficient and more deadly. We've got the pandemic that we've got to deal with. So there's so much reason why we've got to work together right now. And even if it is a competition, China and Russia have been taking the lead in providing the vaccine for other countries around the world. In Africa and other places, the West is trying to catch up, and that's a good thing. I mean, there could be positive competition. Which country can show that it's best suited to serve the world's interest in a positive way? And that's the kind of competition I would like to see, because we have different systems with different assumptions and philosophies behind them. And we can see which can work most efficiently to help the world, rather than to divide the world the way Trump has tried to do for the past 4 years.
Okay. During the G7 virtual summit, it seems that Professor Shen, China will also be one of those topics, at least according to some media reports. Now, I'm not sure because the meeting has just begun. So, Professor Shen, from China's perspective, how are you looking at the meeting? And also, is China seeing an opportunity to develop sound relationship with the members of the G7? On what terms? Professor Shen.
I think President Biden has mentioned that he would. I think President Biden has mentioned that in his speech to be delivered at the G7, he would raise 3 issues: pandemic, economy, and the challenge of China. So for your question, the challenge of China is China has cleared its house very well. So U.S. need to do a good job to compete with China. And second, why China is providing vaccine to its own people, China is also offering international public goods. China has a plan to give this vaccine to 37 countries in the first batch, and China probably would give this to more countries. And then U.S. need to compete with China. And China is shaping international order, which makes China to be looked as more competent. And the U.S. want to lead. U.S. wants to make itself to be viewed as more competent, to have the capacity to lead. So U.S. has changed the term from Trump's time, China and Russia as a rival, to China is a challenger. U.S. has downplayed the so-called threat that China has presented. But China is threatening the U.S. in cleaning its house, in providing public goods. So welcome the U.S. to compete with China in this area, but we need to have a healthy competition, not to blend each other in a negative sense. U.S. can get some lesson how China defeated the pandemic. China can share its experience. And also, we can give money to WHO, U.S. give $4 billion, and putting all this money together, and more countries would give donation, including those from Japan. And we should assure those underdeveloped countries would have a fair amount of weapon to handle a pandemic. If G7 would conclude, let's work with China in a healthy competition and compete wherever there is necessity, but in a positive tone, not to exclude China, to make a clique of exclusion, then I think G7 can be a good existence for China to be compared and to compete with.
All right. Now we have 1 minute left also for Professor Laris. Please share with us the view about G7 China.
Yeah, I mean, the G7 is a traditional meeting China is included in the G20 meeting as it should, but I think it should be perfectly okay if 7 nations want to get together to discuss things without China, without India, without Saudi Arabia. Why not? There's nothing wrong with that. And the G7 is divided among itself. They cooperate in some instances on climate change, on the COVAX initiative, and by the way, the more cash you have for COVAX and for the vaccines, the better you can produce more vaccines, of course. And they are divided in other things. For example, the EU investment treaty with China, which was concluded in December last year, was not all that much applauded by the United States. So they get together and discuss things, and whether they get their act together and are united in all respects, that needs to be seen. But it's not a bad idea to just have a club of nations to talk about things. But I would like to say what is perfectly right is that the United States and China should engage with each other directly. That would be the best way forward. If the two superpowers of the world engage with each other,
Yeah. But I heard your voice and also your ideas. Thank you so much for your contribution. Time is limited for a very comprehensive discussion. Klaus Laris, Kato Yoshikatsu, Peter Kuznick, and Shending Li. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Hope we can continue our conversation in the near future. Really appreciate it. Thank you.